It is now my pleasure to introduce our next panelists on stage. We're going to discuss competitiveness and innovation in European manufacturing. Our last panel today will discuss how the EU should enhance its competitivity in the industrial domain and also which challenges the EU must overcome in terms of innovation, regulation and sovereignty. An introduction will be made now by Ms. Nicola Birch, who is the Vice President of the European Bank of Investment, and she will leverage on her experience as a rapporteur for the Critical Raw Material Act. This session will be moderated by Ms. Laura Piovesan, who is the Director General and also Head of the Projects Directorate at the EIB, addressing how the EU can further strengthen its model based on sustainable industry, touching upon a variety of sectors such as automotive, battery, raw material valorization and recycling, as well as construction and natural capital management. Ms. Beer, the floor is yours.
I think once more maybe a really big applause for Bertrand Piccard. I think this was really an optimistic approach we need in this field if we want to take people with us. And this is optimism I want also to see at the end of a very inspiring day, a day during which we discussed here in the EIB Forum a lot. We discussed about policy challenges in a year of change. I mean, a year of change which will, and it was mentioned, having upcoming European elections, so having also a move towards a new parliament and a new commission. We have discussed the importance of the important topic of cohesion, looking to the future of regional and urban policy, as well as energy security, which is never far from the headlines. And Vice President Dombrovskis spoke on the need to strengthen EU competitiveness and resilience and the vital role that investment has to play. And now, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, now in our last panel of the day, we are going to focus on European manufacturing. How can we ensure its global competitiveness? How can we encourage innovation in the context of the green transition? A strong manufacturing base, we know it, is crucial to our economic autonomy and our resilience in a complex geopolitical environment, including long-term aid to build a sustainable future. To balance the equation, the EU has a Green Deal, a strategy driven by policy and regulation that promotes sustainable growth for industry with good outcomes for citizens and the planet. The Green Deal, in short, aims to ensure that the transition to carbon neutrality is full of opportunities. And there I pick up on what Bertrand Piccard was saying with his optimistic approach. Really, opportunities we have to seize to enhance our competitiveness and to secure sustainable long-term growth. The US, you know it, which has historically managed to create a thriving environment for entrepreneurs to innovate and scale up, is taking a different approach. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which provides grants, loans, and tax credits to public and private entities over long term, is the US answer to tackling domestic industrial competitiveness while reducing its carbon emissions. China, with its heavily subsidized and ever-expanding industrial progress, is becoming a global leader in many green technologies, but its approach lacks conformity with recognized ESG standards. Access to finance in the European Union, by contrast, is often cumbersome and bureaucratic. It is less plentiful and fragmented, with many different national support schemes, such as those in France or Italy or Germany, just to name some few. To succeed, the EU needs to reconcile a number of challenges. One of these is strategic raw materials. It was already mentioned by our moderator, and I worked on as rapporteur for the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Parliament. The legislation creates for the first time a 360 degrees approach on environment that incentivizes private investments, supports supply chain resilience, also partnering with countries abroad, and reduces our external dependencies. With a clear vision of what needs to be done, the challenge of putting it into operation must be addressed swiftly. As the EU's investment arm, the European Investment Bank will have a significant role to play in leveraging the Critical Raw Materials Act to support projects across the EU and beyond that contribute to increasing the EU's autonomy and resilience. To defend competitiveness of our industries, we also have, as a part of the Green Deal, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism to address the issue of carbon leakage and to ensure a level playing field for European businesses, often subject to unfair competition globally. And hopefully, we will be, as Europeans, with the Green Deal, a convincing forerunner to more countries and industry decarbonizing and joining an international CO2 emission trading scheme. The final point I would like to touch upon is that of innovation. Innovation is vital to ensure the European Union remains a strong competitor in the critical technologies necessary for a successful transition to carbon neutrality. The EU needs to create the necessary environment, and by that I mean to allow our successful innovators to scale up and succeed in Europe and with European capital. In answer to the US Inflation Reduction Act, the EU response should be multifaceted, based on smart regulation and tailored financial solutions, forward-thinking regulation developments to reduce red tape, speed up the permitting and decision-making process to create an environment that will not only retain, but attract new scientific minds into European research and development ecosystem. Leveraging new and existing budgetary resources to develop bespoke financial instruments to incentivize an increase in private capital to support investment and scale up of European companies in critical technologies such as digital and deep tech, clean tech and biotech. In combination with these actions will reduce the EU strategic dependencies and enhance its long-term competitiveness. These are just a few points at the core of the competitive challenge that the panel will address today. So we're very happy to have you here on our EIB Forum, and I will now hand over to Laura for the discussion. It was already mentioned, Laura Piovesan is the Director General of our Projects Directorate, so she will now moderate the panel. I'm looking for your results. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Vice President, for setting the scene so well for the panel today. And thank you for my esteemed panelists, very competent panel. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion based on, indeed, what you have set up as a framework. You spoke about the green transition, the strategic autonomy of Europe, and competitiveness. So these are three pieces of the challenges. Are these trade-offs? Are these mutually reinforceable objectives? So this is what I would like indeed to explore with the panel today, but also to look forward at what are the possible actions Europe needs to take in order to strengthen the competitiveness of our industries. So I would like to start with a common question for everyone around what are the most important challenges for EU competitiveness. And I would like to start with you, Matthias Miedrich. Matthias is the CEO of Umicore, and Umicore is a company which has a long history, 200 years of history, and a history of also a transition yourself, which has been moving from metal and smelting into advanced metals and recycling, so a growth story along really this transformation of the industry.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hello, I'm very happy to be here. Indeed, we feel ourselves a little bit at the center of the debate because we are the ones who actually take the critical minerals and make something out of it, make active materials out of it that then power the batteries forward. I liked very much what Bertrand Piccard was saying on efficiency. I might come back to that a little bit later. But one point I wanted to make, 2 points actually, to answer your question. I think the 2 points that are key to be done to keep or increase competitiveness are pretty much just to do 2 things that are already there. The number one is the Green Deal and all the surrounding mechanics that have been put in place. The Critical Raw Material Act is a very good act. The Net Zero Industry Act as well, the CHIPS Act as well. So this is all very good and sets, I think, a benchmark also globally. But what is not good is the execution of that. So what we as companies, and you might hear that from my colleagues as well, see every day when we try to get permits, when we try to put projects in the ground, when we try to actually do. So that will be our point: speed, execution, walk the talk. It's not needed to put new laws in place, it's just to apply the laws in the most consistent way. And the second one, that might be surprising to you, I think we are losing the strengths of the single market. And I have to say, as a company, I'm not saying we are not benefiting from that if states compete to have investments located in their jurisdictions by, giving bigger grant packages and bigger grant packages and bigger grant. It's good for us as an individual company if we play it right, but as a European citizen, it's actually giving away one of the key strengths, which is the single market, which is a powerful instrument versus other countries. So I think, in a nutshell, apply the Green Deal and stick to the single market.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias. And indeed, the single market and the need to complete or modernize the single market was mentioned earlier this morning. And I think it's a point maybe we can come back on what is needed on that later. But now let me pass to Nicola Kim. Nicola, she's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Heidelberg Cement. And indeed, cement is considered a hard-to-abate sector. It's very much responsible for CO2 emissions, but Heidelberg Cement has quite an ambitious strategy for decarbonization yourself. No? So from your point of view, what do you see as challenges that EU needs to overcome?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And first, I'd also like to thank the EIB for the funding support in order to help finance our research, development, and innovative efforts on carbon reduction and circularity. So Heidelberg Materials is one of the largest cement and concrete manufacturers in the world. We're active in 50 countries. And as many of you will know, cement and concrete represents about 8% of global emissions. So it's very urgent that we tackle decarbonization for this sector. We have the most ambitious target in the industry, 50% reduction by 2030. And if we think about the challenges, it's very much linked to the 3 levers, the technical levers that we address. So overall, we can say that the issue is large-scale implementation. And in terms of the 3 levers, we look at product, so product innovation. There we look at different recipes, different formulations for circularity or replacement of the cement. And one of the challenges is every country has different standards. And that might be for concrete applications or percent recycled content. So there's a harmonization under development with the EU, so that's very critical. The second lever is process optimization. So here we talk about energy efficiency and circular technology. So, and here one of the limiting factors is permitting. So we deal with a lot of administrative effort, red tape, to scale up technologies. So one example is we have technology where we take construction demolition waste, we separate it into different fractions and actually use those different fractions to make new concrete. So this saves virgin materials, this reduces carbon footprint, and we were delayed several months through permitting issues. So this is really a bottleneck for us. And the third one is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So this is a key technology for us because 2/3 of our emissions come from the reaction to make cement. So these are unavoidable emissions. And So to scale up CCUS, we need to have a strong business case. We need a carbon price to make the business case work. We need to have CCUS allowed in all countries. We are going to be the first company deploying carbon capture at full scale, at operational scale in Norway. And we were able to do that, not just through EU innovation funding, but also through local funding in Norway. And so the EU Innovation Fund is actually focused more on innovative topics, so new technologies, new storage, and not really on scalable deployment. So those are the main challenges.
No, thank you for bringing in indeed the topics of permitting, which I know it's an important topic for many here, standards, but also the markets, the market pool. Now, same question again, and this time maybe a different perspective, because we move now to Björn Zikarski, and Björn is the Chief Executive Office of Pure Battery Technologies, a startup company which is working on cathodes materials, so materials for batteries. And you also have a different perspective because you live in Australia, so you can also bring in this global perspective, comparing European challenges with global challenges.
Yeah, thank you very much, and honored to be here to contribute to, hopefully, which is a thought leadership. A lot of it, what we say, is responsive to policies, but we'd also like to move forward in a positive manner. Maybe answering your question is by providing you a little story about our company. Why is Pure Battery Technologies here? We are a small company. We're not a Heidelberg Cement or Umicore. We're just very humble, 50 people. But we're a technology company, and that's one of the challenges. How can you be competitive? We're a technology company that has what is referred to often a very cool flow sheet for the process engineers around you. That means our processing of materials is innovative. It's clever chemistry. It's considered green and sustainable by many parties. And we have always focused on CO2 reduction, cost reduction, and recycling of nickel, manganese, and cobalt, which is the most common elements currently, or the most sought after elements going into batteries for the energy transition. We have achieved a reduction of CO2 of 60% compared to our fellow competitors, I call it, or fellow participants in the industry. We've been able to reduce CapEx by 60% and OpEx by 50%. So as a company, through especially last year, we have now reached a price level for our plant refinery in Hagen in Germany, which is price competitive or cost competitive with Asia. And I'm not even, adding on the CO2 credits that we might be able to monetize, which we're hoping to then share with our customers. So why am I saying this? Is we don't require a green premium to be competitive. We have worked hard on the ability to create a competitive infrastructure that will lead to autonomy. And this is what the European discussion is about. How can we be more autonomous? How can we be more independent of Asia? As an example, part of our technology brings with it some other environmental benefits other than just cost and CO2. We just received our permit for our 10,000 ton of metal refinery in Hagen in Germany. We got all the environmental approvals. I can have long discussions with Matthias about how we deal with wastewater and things like that, and we've been able to be innovative and actually get a permit. Not saying that it was easy, not saying that I haven't lost the rest of my hair during that time, but we're standing, we're moving forward. We're very faithful that we can accomplish our very ambitious goal. People always say, do you hope? I said, no, mate, hope is the poor cousin of faith, right? So we're faithful that we're going to get there. And EIB has joined us 14 months ago. They provided us with support. Energy, who is a collaboration of the EBA, European Battery Alliance, has joined the ship as well, and we're now currently working hard on closing out the funding so we can start construction of our plant. Again, why am I saying this? Autonomy. We talked about this. I think innovation is very important in order to create autonomy. You got to support, something that is new, something that breaks the mold, that breaks the barriers, And otherwise, how can we be competitive with a cost environment like Asia? This is not, won't be possible. Matthias made a good point about single market. Yeah, we got to protect it, but do we just do it with grants or not allowing them to come here? It's not the solution at the end. I think we just got to be better. And when I look at the Green Deal, I refer to it as a philosophical framework. And Net Zero Act, CHIP Act, the Critical Mineral Act are great things, but they need to be implemented. And we have the systems, we have the structures in Europe. And though I live in Australia, I consider myself European because by my accent you can tell I'm German. So coming back to that Critical Minerals Act, just want to talk about that one real quick. It's all about integrating the supply chain. Right? It's about making sure that the materials end up where they end up. And we always used to say in the refinery business, you build a refinery and the material will follow. So we got to build really cool and efficient and cost-effective refineries. They don't necessarily employ the most people because a lot of it is automated, but neither is an automotive factory. Right? So
that's exactly what China did, right? They have no natural resources, but they have a lot of refineries.
Yes, exactly. And they're getting the metal out of yeah. Then I can talk. Thanks for pointing that out, and can talk about raw material. You know, when we can process it, it will come. People forget that the ambitious goals that we have in the EU for EV penetration, we have 80% of the nickel, 80% of the manganese, 80% of the lithium to meet those goals. And that's in Eastern Europe, that's in Germany, that's in New Caledonia, and that's in Finland. We have the metals. Of course, do we want to mine in an environment that's very, very costly? We don't have to. But if we build the refineries and provide the end product, which we can do cost competitively, then the metal will follow. You know, there's nothing wrong with importing nickel out of Indonesia. There's nothing wrong with importing metal out of Brazil or other places of the world. But if we're good in refining metals that we used to do, and then we'll be fine. So it's all about technology from my perspective. It brings me to scaling innovation. So we're an innovative company, we're a small company. We didn't invent the bee's knees, but we came up with something really cool. And then the people go, oh, it's small, isn't it? And I'm like, yep, it's small. And it starts small, and then you gotta go bigger. And scaling, I told my fellow panel members earlier, when you scale businesses in Europe, there is not a lot of welcome, right? There is not a lot of support. There is seed funding, there's venture funding. Very early, when you work on concepts and new innovative ideas, everybody wants to be sexy. But when it then comes into the nitty-gritty and scaling things in an operational and an industrial sense, there's not a lot of support. You end up being forced into a bad deal, or you go to the US, where the markets are bigger, Canada, US, you sell it to an Asian party because they have a lot of money, and they implement it then faster in where they live. So there is actually a report just recently came out about where the biggest gap in funding is, and the biggest gap in funding is when it's about scaling innovation in Europe. And I think that's where we got to do more. And I'm not asking for grants, I'm not asking for free money. I'm saying Norway demonstrates with a sovereign wealth fund how they invest money. They take equity. They build a good team. There's plenty of bankers that look for challenges. They go to one of those funds and they build good teams and they invest and they get a return for that money and everybody's happy. And I think we got to go away from just granting money and keeping everybody out. But we probably have to look at how we can, complement the regulatory framework that asks us to do certain things with taking more risk. I made a joke in the US, when you take risk and you fail, they say that's fun, wonderful, now you learned it, go do it again, So there's also social and cultural things that we have to overcome in Europe. When you fail in Europe, very often you'll be a taxi driver or now an Uber driver for the rest of your life. That has to change.
Thank you, Björn, and indeed for talking chemistry, bringing your own example, and also talking about funding and the gap in scale-up funding that Europe is experiencing, where we also risk losing some of our better companies and ideas to both either Asia or US. Now, to conclude this first round, Martin Berg, Chief Executive of Climate Asset Management, and also the person to whom I want to ask about a difficult topic, the difficult nut to crack in competitiveness around natural capital, agricultural, and where do you see these challenges in this area?
Yeah, no. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. So, yeah, so maybe I explain. I'm feeling a bit like the odd candidate here in this panel. So I'm neither working for an industrial company, nor is my sector really the industrial sector. So, but I thought, Laura, that you said like it's also good to think about what other factors are actually affecting competitiveness in the industrial sector. And I think so. What we are is we are an asset management firm based in London. We have 40 people, so even a bit smaller than my previous speaker. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus on natural capital as an investment class. And you may ask, well, how does it actually fit now in this panel? And I think perhaps I come from two perspectives. First perspective is that we're talking mostly when we talk about the industrial sector about mitigation. But if you think about how we actually get to the ambitious targets that Europe set itself, without focusing on nature, we won't get there. 25% of all emissions roughly are related to nature, so we can do whatever we want on the industrial side. We won't get there. And on the other hand, actually, there is a huge opportunity using nature as an ability to further remove CO2, not only through trees but also through soil. And I think that's exactly what the EU is working on with their removal framework, to actually acknowledging that there's a huge opportunity as well, not only a challenge. And then the other way, the link to the industrial side is really, I think, when we think about how we want to achieve the targets, we also have to think about different types of products that we're using. So when I think about the building sector, we're talking a lot about using now timber as I actually met a company that wants to put a skyscraper made out of bamboo. Bamboo is actually not a tree, it's a grass. So they have really fascinating ideas out there. And I think especially when you look in certain parts of Europe, they are also very good examples how other can be achieved. So that's what we're all about. I think Bertrand Piccard really spoke exactly the way we try to frame the issue. The question now is how do you make this scalable? How do you make this investable? And that's what we're all about. So we're working with institutional investors and with corporates on investment vehicles that, among other things, also invest in Europe. Now, the challenges. I think the big challenge when we think about agriculture and forestry is that I think it's very clear when you look at all the frameworks that the way we do agriculture, invest or produce forestry products has to change dramatically. We have to look at it in a very different way, in the traditional way of producing as much as possible yield at any environmental cost can no longer work. But the question is, how do you get there? And I think, Matthias, you laid it out very nicely in that way. There are a lot of frameworks when we look in Europe and the agriculture side, very similar to the industrial sector. We have the Farm to Fork initiative. We have, when you look at the new common agriculture policy, when you look at the guidance, I think everybody's recognizing that. But what we see at the moment, when you look at some of the demonstrations from farmers, we see the challenge, how we implement this. So I think we need to, and that's why I really liked Bertrand Piccard's speech, we need to do the same for the agriculture side. We need to find the positive way to saying that the transition can actually be helpful for all involved, and that's of course also a social question. So maybe we'll leave it here.
Thank you, Martin. And so we spoke about the challenges, and you have named quite a few. You also said, well, we do have the framework, Matthias, and we need to make it work. So I would like to focus this second round of discussion, and please feel free to intervene on any question around how we make it work. So what are the enablers that we can leverage in order to make it work? And I would like to start with regulation, because you mentioned permitting, Björn, you mentioned standards, Nicola, you also mentioned, and is it an enabler or is it a bottleneck? And How do you see that?
Yeah, I would say that it is actually, it should be an enabler. Sometimes it's a bottleneck, but it fits really very well what Bertrand Piccard said earlier. I want to bring this to the discussion about efficiency, because let me give you one example. The Critical Raw Material Act is a regulation that should, at the end of the day, assure that Europe has enough critical minerals to do the Green Deal. Now, if you just apply it on face value, what you would like to do, what you would try to do, to unlock as many supply streams of nickel, cobalt, manganese, whatever, that come to Europe or are in Europe that can be used. The more clever way, indeed, would be to say first, how can we reduce the need for those? And what's coming in there is what I would call the technology efficiency of the application of those laws. So, and by the way, I would like to mention as well that exactly that's the topic where we are working together with the EIB now, and where we just have signed, before coming into this meeting room, an agreement for a 350 million euro loan that is especially focused on R&D and innovation in the battery material supply chain to work on the fact that we need less critical minerals, that the same function of the battery is used with less nickel, less cobalt. It's also about the efficiency in the processing, in the supply chain. I don't know if you know that if you go to a mine and take out a portion of raw material until it is in the electric car, over the whole supply chain, you have lost 30% of it. 30%. So you can save every third mine in the world if your efficiency would be 100% in the different processing steps. And the last topic of efficiency that should be considered in the application of the regulation is on CapEx efficiency. You know, we all have to spend in this industry billions of euros to build the gigafactories, and that's slowing down the application of the legislations, of the framework. So we also have to use the technology to make that less capex dense, the whole exercise. So on all of those three fronts, if you just read the law as it is, you don't see that. So my point is the success is in a clever application of an efficient rollout and not just by the book.
Thank you indeed. Interesting, introducing the word efficiency when we talk about regulation. And Nicola,
I hope you don't think it's a contradiction.
No. I think it's a pragmatic approach. And Nicola, I think you wanted to mention also some kind of positive examples of how the regulation can be indeed an enabler for competitiveness.
Yeah, I think there are several facilitators that have helped us to accelerate our decarbonization efforts. First, the EU ETS. It really helped us to create long-term planning on decarbonization activities. I think that the challenge will be over the next decade when the allowances go away. How do we make sure that the carbon price paid for certain industries gets reallocated to decarbonize those industries? A second facilitator, I think, will be CBAM. So we are optimistic that with CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism, that we will be able to create an even level playing field in Europe and versus companies which are outside of Europe. Another example mentioned earlier is the Green Deal. So the Green Deal has set a framework, but now we really need to take it a step forward to implement and to see that the sustainable buildings and infrastructure are really driven. And finally, yesterday we heard about the Net Zero Industry Act, so very optimistic that that will help us going forward. There's a strong focus on CCUS as a key enabler for decarbonization. The Act recommends simplified permitting to enable projects and has specific recommendations on increasing storage capacity, so 50 million tons per annum by 2030 are mentioned. So a lot of developments already in place that we can be quite optimistic going forward.
And you mentioned carbon capture as storage. And for example, can you give me a practical example of what would be needed to enable the investments in carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, so if we think about the business case for carbon capture, the business case going forward in the next decade works if we look at the combination of funding and carbon price, as well as market creation. So that all needs to happen in order for the business case to be positive.
Thank you. And in terms of regulation, of course, we spoke already a lot about the Critical Raw Material Act. So again, Björn, you mentioned, well, let's set up the refining in Europe and the materials will come. Okay, what else do you think is needed to maintain a strategic autonomy when it comes to critical raw material in Europe?
What were the alternatives to material? Is that what you asked me? Sorry, I couldn't.
No, indeed, what is it needed to maintain the competitiveness in Europe and strategic autonomy when it comes to critical raw material? We have this as the Critical Raw Material Act, which sets out percentages that Europe will need to become independent on.
Yeah, I mean, the Raw Material Act has certain KPIs that they would like to achieve, right? And the question is are this the right KPIs? Can they be achieved or do they make sense? I think the critical raw materials, as Matthias pointed out, is to get critical raw materials. I'm not just talking about nickel, manganese, cobalt. There is, there's tungsten. There is raw earth metals. There's everything that goes into your little phones here. How do you have to how do you make them come to Europe? And again, processing centers make sense. But coming to the KPIs of the Critical Raw Material Act, for the people that might not know all the detail, and I don't know all the details of the entire act either, but the goals are 10% of raw material has to come from Europe.
Is it ambitious enough? And this is good to have an ambitious
numbers,
target.
I don't think the numbers are ambitious at all. Well, you can argue both ways, right? So first of all, I come from sport, and the higher the hurdle, the easier it is to get close to it, and the likeliness that you achieve something, right? So records are meant to be broken. So if you don't set any hurdles, you say like, let's just all get together and make sure we get some critical minerals in here, then nothing's going to happen. So you have to set a bar, and the bar at 10%. We had to think about it. Is it hard? No, it's not, because these kind of minerals are abundantly available in Europe. The question is, do we want to mine them or not? And that's a decision for every jurisdiction to make, for the society to make, whether they want to be in cost-intensive mining processes or not. A lot of mining processes are getting continuously improved. BHP, I think, just launched the first battery trucks this week. So it's getting better and better. Mining is not as dirty anymore as it used to be, but it's still not the most pleasant thing to do. So 10% of raw material, I gave the numbers earlier. You go to Eastern Europe, there's all the manganese that we could probably use. If battery specification changes, it might be different. But there's a lot of nickel in New Caledonia, but New Caledonia is not cost effective if you compare to Indonesia, right? No, it's more like a holiday island than an industrial center. And then you have other materials. So 10% I think can be achieved. 25% of recycling, I definitely have faith that Europe can achieve that, because there is too many clever people and there is too many support already for that as well, that 25% of metal recycling can be achieved. Europeans are good recyclers. We've done it, we've shown it. Whether it works or not, I'm not an expert, but with trash, trash recycling, plastic recycling and things like that. It works, it can be done. The question I have on the 40% is of the processing. 40% of the material needs to be processed in Europe, so European content. And I'm skeptical on that, not because I'm in that sector, but I think it's more challenging, and it comes down to regulations, it comes down to permitting. We talked about permit, we got a permit. Our fellow industry participants have been fighting against one individual in a certain country in Europe that thinks he needs to be God or better than the Supreme Court. And that held up, I don't know, probably over $1 billion of investment so far. held it up and is not helping us to build infrastructure that we desperately need if we want to really be a player in the energy transition. So from that perspective, you know, the European the European Battery Alliance, in cooperation with Vice President Šefčovič, has done a lot, but they're also fighting the red tape, and hopefully we can declutter it more.
Björn, may I have a different opinion on one topic? I fully agree on everything. I think I'm more pessimistic on the battery recycling quota. And why? Not because I don't believe that there are enough companies who could do it, but when we look into the world, we have seen that a lot of companies have started to get into that with the attitude to say, okay, it's recycling, so we will do it, but it's actually much more difficult than that. So the metallurgical extraction of materials is very, very difficult to do it in the yields and in the scale that you need to do. And we have seen a couple of examples in the industry that have given up, meanwhile, because they have simply underestimated the capex that is needed, for example, or in the regulation there are efficiencies mentioned that need to be met in the recycling topics. That's not trivial, and I think the industry on a broad scale is not there yet to solve it technically. I think this is a little bit too rosy. I think what we hear everywhere, startups coming up, the core metallurgical extraction, in our definition, to come from scrap to metal salts or to metal, there are not a lot of players who can do it. So I'm more pessimistic. The other one, I fully agree.
So, I think we have also heard about the need for ecosystem and an integrated supply chain, both when it comes to the circular economy and the resilience of this supply chain. So what you see as gaps in the EU supply chains and value chains, but need to be filled? What are in your view the critical gaps to support the competitiveness? Martin, can I ask you this?
Well, I mean, we're in a very different sector, I would say, in that sense. So what we probably see is that now going to the natural capital sector, which is, I think, mainly agriculture here in Europe, is that we're still importing a lot of products that we could actually do here in Europe ourselves. And what we see is that a lot of the regulation that is coming through is actually driving now more and more investors to look for that, and more corporates to look into their supply chain and saying, where's actually things coming from? What is the carbon footprint related to that? On top of that, we see more and more targets relating to nature. There are more frameworks that are coming up from that, both internationally and also under the EU. To just give you a positive, because you also asked for the positive examples. So what we have done, for example, is we converted land in Spain and Portugal that was previously used for either grassland or tobacco into regenerative farms for almonds, and with that we are replacing the import of almonds, which are mainly coming from California at the moment in all over Europe under sometimes very, let's say, stressful environmental conditions. So I think that's a good example. If you look for the positive examples where you can exactly look at that, maybe also help then some of the European companies in their supply chains, probably not in the manufacturing line, but probably more in areas where they use natural products. But I think it's a good example. And then the other nice thing is from that perspective that we're actually doing this with a very attractive return for our investors. So it's a great example where by going in a more longer-term, sustainable managed product, you can also at the same time generate a higher return, which is, I think, exactly what Bertrand Piccard tried to explain. Like, those are the kind of examples we need, and I think we need to communicate this better, that they actually exist.
I'm grateful for Bertrand Piccard to have set this panel on a positive and track of focusing very much on opportunities, while it could have been a panel complaining about the lack of opportunities maybe in Europe, or the barriers in Europe. So on opportunities, and indeed So when I'm talking about the gaps in supply chain, is there are also opportunities in the supply chain. And Nicola, yes.
Yeah, I think one of the gaps is in public procurement. So we see in the NGO space and company-NGO collaboration with the First Mover Coalition, for example, initiated by the World Economic Forum, clear criteria on sustainable procurement. So what is a sustainable cement or concrete, and to form a collaboration across the value chain. I think if we want to drive a Green Deal and Net Zero Industry Act, we need to also stimulate the market through public procurement.
No, indeed, and this would create the business case and the market that you were pointing to as lacking as one of the challenges. And another opportunities also comes through partnership. I think, Björn, you mentioned the Battery Alliance as a partnership, but also, Umiko, you do have experience of partnerships.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. We talk about even ecosystems in that sense, because the transformation that we are in our case, that's the mobility transformation, is extremely needed for the Green Deal, right? We have to have electric vehicles. At the same time, it's extremely difficult. So no company can do that alone. And so the network between the companies, the network between public and private, the public-private partnerships, and our agreement with the EIB is a very good example of that we have signed today, to drive forward the innovations needed and to put the load on different shoulders that then carry this big load. This is also something that maybe Europe can have a competitive advantage against other countries, because the European idea is exactly that partners work together to solve a common goal. And I think so far we see very good progress in these regards.
Thank you. As I mentioned when we started the panel, it's really a timely discussion, because the Commission has issued a recommendation to set up a very ambitious target for 2040 of 90% of emission reduction, and this is a target which comes with a very hefty price tag, so 1.5 trillion every year, 2030, 2040, of investments needed. So if you, and I would like to ask each of you the same question, if you had the possibility to indeed give a recommendation in terms of where the priority for investment should be placed in this next framework, what would you point to? Maybe, Björn, shall we start?
It's a short answer, and in the processing supply chain. And it's not because I'm there, but I think that's where the raw materials is almost commodity goods. You can get them into the market, but then processing them for the needs that you have is a key competence, and you should invest in those. I refer to it as an infrastructure. And we're building airports, we're building bridges, we're building highways, and we have to build processing infrastructure. It's the same as having bakeries and having other things. You need to invest in those areas and make sure that they're competitive.
So when you talk about infrastructure, can you give some concrete examples?
An oil refinery is an infrastructure. A battery material refining company or a cell maker is an infrastructure. If that is the direction that we want to go and accelerate the energy transition by storing energy and using renewable energy and things like that, then you need to invest in those things. Matthias said that's what the Chinese have done. They started 15, 20 years ago. So we have a catch-up to do.
So starting from the building blocks, let's say, the materials. Yeah. Nicola?
Yeah, my desire would be to have certainty around political and regulatory environments. So to support the business case for us to invest in these technologies, and carbon pricing, and certainty around the regulatory part.
Martin?
When I think about it, and again, I come from my sector, then of course the big elephant in the room. So first of all, in order to achieve the 2040 targets, which I think the recommendation is 90%, as I said before, without addressing the emissions that are coming from the land-based sector, we won't get there. So that's I think has to be underlined. How do you get there at the moment when you have a common agriculture policy that is still not providing the right incentives to actually change behaviors on that side? And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. There is a clear path to the transition. Anybody who looks at it knows that changes have to be done, but it's extremely challenging to do that without at the same time providing the right incentives to the farmers and the communities that are mostly affected. And I think that's what I would wish for, that we come up with very clear incentives. And again, I think it's a certainty or the long term that is important there. Everybody just looks now on I have the next cap and for the next 5 years, can I really change that quickly? And what is if the regulation then after that's changed again? I think that's a real problem and then also I think a sector that is by definition quite conservative. So I think it's providing the right incentives and then at the same time providing the long-term certainty that it's not only for 5 years but really until 2040.
Yeah, for me it's 2 points. Sector specific in our industry, it's processing, because if you look to 2030 and if you look to all the electric vehicles that should be built in 2030, only 60% of them will have the right materials from European sources. So there's a 40% gap. So 40% of the battery materials have to be sourced, the processed battery materials have to be sourced from outside Europe. So that has to change. It needs to be 100% or close to 100%. Secondly, cross-sector, again, I come back to the efficiency. Focus on the net, not on the gross. So make sure that we are harmonizing that and we are incentivizing the efficient use of the resources and not just the growth of the sources of the materials.
So you spoke again about efficiency, and indeed, and we spoke about materials. Circular economy, it is a potential enabler because it does enable this efficiency, but we have discussed many barriers to this, starting from different standards, different regulation, different requirements, but also technical barriers.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And just to make one important point, what is the reason for circularity in batteries? Why do we want to do battery recycling in the industry? It's actually not, in the first place, to secure the supply of materials. That's a side effect, because battery recycling is the only way that the industry can meet the CO2 legislation of an electric vehicle. If you have an electric vehicle, and you all know the story of, I have to drive my electric vehicle for 80,000 kilometers before I am net CO2 negative, because building that vehicle, the battery has emitted so and so many tons of CO2. So by recycling, you get that down to by 95%. And that's one of the key reasons. Now, the hurdle, as I said, is mostly a technological hurdle, because when you ask today, what are you doing? I'm doing battery recycling, can mean everything. I'm a company that is dismantling batteries from a car, to, at the other extreme, a metallurgical processing factory that is extracting the battery-grade metals again. And there is black mass, and there is shredding, and there's all these steps in between. But I think the debate doesn't focus enough on the most important part of that value chain, the metallurgical extraction. So to get to this very, very precious metals that have nearly no CO2, we still have a technological fight to make that in the right extraction yields and at the right capital cost.
He made a very good point about the CO2. Recycling batteries, CO2 reduction is much bigger than getting primary material out of mines and processing it. You can do that with recycling now. You can, but that's what we don't want. You can throw it all in a big smelter. And you can separate the metals, you have them all back. But that CO2 footprint is higher than mining it. So we started down that path, and we said we have to reduce the CO2 emissions. So we need to get innovative processes into recycling. So I'm not taking back my argument that I think we're going to get there with 25%, but it's a complex undertaking. It's not as simple as separating plastics. So I just want to clarify that.
No, absolutely. And also in the cement industry, circularity is the way to achieve CO2 reductions, no?
Yeah, so for us, circularity is equally important to CO2. You have circularity already in the cement production because you use slag from the steel industry, fly ash from coal-fired power plants to produce cement. And in concrete, what we are now shifting towards is separating the fractions, using it again, and this can be done today. So we really need to see how we can shift away from virgin materials and look for the built environment to get these materials.
Okay, so maybe I turn to the audience to see if there are questions from the audience, and you have the opportunity indeed to ask questions to our panelists.
Thank you very much. Very, very insightful. I'm Nicolas Pio, CEO of Tilt Capital. I'm a growth investment fund, so I understand what you say about how hard it is to invest in that segment. Two quick questions. One, to what extent do you think that I don't want to say the lack of integration, but the need for further integration of Europe may be one of the reasons why it's harder to scale up in Europe compared to the US or Asia? One question. Depth of the market, etc. And the second, and I'm drawing upon the last comment of Matthias, 100% in Europe. Shouldn't we think differently about supply chains and cooperations with other countries that could also have I would say, a role in securing new supply chains and new cooperations formed between Europe and those countries instead of having some sort of dependency as we used to have and we still have in Europe?
Thank you. So the focus is really around battery materials, let's say.
Let me maybe ask the last question first. I fully agree, because there should be a certain threshold that we put out, and this threshold should purely be based on CO2. I give you a very good example. Indonesia is a heaven for the battery industry because nickel is abundantly available. Björn said we should have nickel from Indonesia. I agree. The problem is that 98% of all of the nickel in Indonesia is mined by by mines that use coal-powered energy. So you take the nickel out, you bring it in a European battery, it's defeating the purpose. But indeed, the workaround has to be that in Indonesia, a certain value add is installed. So we're talking about mine. The next step is called HPAL. The step afterward is called refining, and then there's PCAM, etc. So that's something the industry will see, that companies, consortiums will go there to A, install renewable energy, and B, go to a certain processing step. And there's a nice side effect. If you increase the processing in the region where the raw material is, the amount of material you have to ship gets much smaller. So more energy dense, if you want, or more material dense, so the CO2 of transportation is reduced. So I fully agree, this needs to be part of the story. Now, what taints that a little bit is the protectionism of some areas. Another good example I have is the IRA in the US and the non-inclusion of Europe as a zone of the IRA. If that would happen, it would be an immensely positive effect on efficiencies of CapEx, because in each of the regions there are always capacities that are not 100% used. If they could float between each other, that would be another very good part of international cooperation.
And on the first question, which was around, is Europe at a disadvantage because we are more fragmented, we have smaller markets? And for example, you mentioned before to me the example of Canada as an alternative.
Yeah, so as we are a global company, we make experience everywhere in terms of how projects are taken. Canada, for example, for us was a very good example where everything went very fast because it was one country. Now, if I look to Europe, what would be now, as of today, if you ask me, what's the biggest risk or hurdle of being fragmented? I think it is the whole regulation about battery recycling and what happens with the battery when it is dismantled from a car. In some countries, it's okay. In other countries, it's a toxic waste that needs to be processed. Other countries even in Europe, forbid the export of used batteries into another country because they want to exploit the raw materials. If we start like this, there is no advantage of a single market.
I think there was a question about scaling technology in a European environment, and obviously, a kind of system in China where, or in Korea even, or where winners are picked and you do this and you do this and you do this. There's certain parties in China, you go for one thing and you cannot go to the other one because it's directed that they get to do this. It's, by the way, also similar in Japan, so it's not just, not just a political issue. Scaling across then Europe is when you're talking about a single market. You have certain companies in one country wanting to do similar things than the one in the next country. Then you would argue there is more competition, but then you also need scale, and this is where we're losing out as Europe all the time. We're talking about big funding packages that Europe is making available for the energy transition. But in China, you get a support package. You hear about support packages of 150 billion every other week, right? So they just work on a different scale, and it's similar to the IRA. There's a lot more money available than it is here. So you're fighting with two different weapons. You're bringing a knife to a gunfight. So when you're looking at scaling then, and you need money for that, you're always going to be a little bit behind. And so that's why I find it, even though it's a single market, it's much more complex to do it in a member society of the European Union where you have 28 or 29, not sure.
27.
27. Did you take the UK out now? Okay, thank you. So anyways, where you have a number of parties that have to agree, makes it much harder. And it takes longer.
Yeah, I also want to stress the point of collaboration across countries in Europe when it comes to CCUS, because if you think about building pipelines which cross different countries, different legislations, the collaboration required between the producer, the pipeline provider, the storage provider, the transport, shipping. So there are there's a lot of things to work out in that kind of a scenario. So I think if there are several projects now underway which are cross-Europe projects, so we're going to have to see that we harmonize some of the ways we approach this.
And indeed, you mentioned CO2 infrastructure in this case as well, so the point of the needing of investing in infrastructure which enable the transition as one of the priorities.
Exactly. So what people might not be aware of is that concrete is vitally important for the transition to renewable electricity, to make dams, to make wind farms, and it's fully recyclable and it's durable. So we need concrete and cement for the green transition.
Okay, my watch has finished the batteries actually, so I don't know how much time we still have, but I think we do still have a bit of time for a question before I sum up. One question. If there is no question, there are two questions, okay.
Hello, Sylvain Barrette de Lano. First question is for Martin. I was a bit stunned when you were talking about this project to repurpose some land in Spain to produce almond in order to avoid relying on California, which is, I think, the largest producer of almonds in the world. But as we all know, almond is in need of a lot of water to be produced. And we also all know the water crisis in Spain. So are we finding a solution by creating another problem down the road? And the second question is for Matthias. I would like to have just your perspective. I heard about this company in California, I can't remember the name. They're basically using all the used batteries, putting them into a container, just like that, and using that as a storage room for the power grid. So whenever the demand is very high, they can use the energy from those containers, right, that are used as power grid. And then whenever those batteries have provided the last bit of juice, getting rid of them. I'm not sure whether the concept from your perspective makes sense, and whether there's still something to extract from those batteries having no juice anymore.
Let me see if there is also there was a second question. You said we take that as well, and then.
Thank you. Tatiana de Queiroz from Mere Capital Partners, and somebody else from the investment landscape. Bjorn, you mentioned something about playing catch-up, and something which seems to have been the elephant in the room is Europe. We have the technologies, we have the R&D, but over the last 15 years, we've been focusing much more on services and digitalization, and suddenly manufacturing with geopolitical tensions has suddenly become very important once again, but we're also 10 to 15 years behind in our investments, in our infrastructure, in the sexiness of the industry. So I'd love a little comment, maybe from each panelist, about how can Europe and you as industry, what can we do to leverage our value added and better play catch up with Asia, the US also, so it's not only coming from the East.
Okay, I think we have quite a full round of questions, so
you want to start me on the almonds?
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. Almonds need a lot of water in California too, by the way, and that's part of the problem, but the way they're produced there. I think it goes back to what came through in this panel, and that's efficiency. So it's on the one hand side, finding the right sites where you have water, and secondly, using it efficiently. And I think that's the only way you can do that. So also on the agriculture sector, that's exactly one of the key themes. And there's a lot more technology now available how we can do that. But maybe what's interesting on this specific project, not all of them they're financing, but there are a few of them they're actually benefiting from also, and this goes to the, like, where do we choose to do our project? There's actually an interesting also EIB supported project, the Alqueva Dam, which actually is a 20-year planning process, I think, going back to the Commission actually trying to identify areas where agriculture could be done in areas with very low water levels. And I think that's a great example also where I think the policy comes together with then the opportunity. So we're actually aggregating projects, but two of our projects they're actually benefiting from that, and that secures water, and they're actually the two top projects in our risk list on water scarcity that actually have no problem. So I think it's a combination, the right location, the right policies, and efficiency.
Thank you. And
so from elements to batteries now. So yes, it's a good idea, and it's an idea that's not only by this one company in California, it's a general idea of what's called the second life of those batteries. And actually, when a battery comes out of a car after 10, 12 years, it's not true that this battery is dead. It has around, with modern battery technology, still around 80–70% of the new value. So you can do a lot with it. The important thing is to detect in the moment you get it back what's that called, the so-called state of health. Because if you know it of all your batteries, you can make a good container and you can. You know what's in, and that's very, if you say, trendy for the energy providers today, and where the energy providers in the past were wanting to use hydrogen to store renewable energy because of the advancements of battery technologies. The battery, this concept of second life, is getting really momentum right now, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, at the end of all of that, and they have been, used and are really down, your question is, can you still get something out of it? And that's the beauty of metallurgy, because metal doesn't care. So they're indefinably recyclable, and the metal comes out as fresh as you would get it from a mine. So you can run down a battery until it's complete dead and recover all of the metals.
And there will be healthy competition about second life battery power providers and people that want to recycle the material early. So it's an interesting observation to have in the market.
So around the second question then on leveraging strength of the European industry, or more broadly, in order to catch up. First of all, do we need to catch up, or you think we are well placed?
I think we need to catch up because, indeed, industrial activities have not been sexy the last years. There are some countries, like I mentioned Canada before, that have identified that electrification and the energy transition is a chance for reindustrialization. Canada has lost its automotive industry to Mexico in the 90s. And have now a very good chance to bring back a big value add portion because they have the raw materials, they have the talent, they have the renewable energy. In Europe, what we have is technology. We have technology and we have companies that know how to do it. And I'm not so pessimistic because I feel that through this energy transition, also the attractiveness of manufacturing as an industry to young people, to talents, has been increased. To work in a battery gigafactory, this is something sexy. So I'm not so pessimistic as you are, maybe.
Martin?
Yeah, probably. I would agree that the big thing that Europe has is really the know-how and the technology, and I think now also for the sector I'm working in, I think that will be the important part to kind of implement this now and see how we can transform the know-how into actually real action on the ground.
For the construction materials industry in Europe, it's not about catch-up because we're really at the forefront of the materials development, and it's more about accelerating, deploying, implementing.
And maybe it's not about catch-up, it's just like a lot of things in life are cyclical, We build a strong manufacturing base and then, decided to outsource, and now we're insourcing again. And we just have to, we might have lost our way a little bit and just get it back, and maybe our next generation or the two generations after us, they're going to make the same thing again, and they outsource everything to the next continent, and the cycle continues.
Okay, no, thank you. And let me try to summarize this very lively exchange. So first of all, we spoke about what are the challenges. We do have a framework. Now the framework needs to be implemented, we need to make it work, as you said, Matthias. And indeed, making it work means also looking at the implementing the regulation in a way that it's an enabler, indeed, and not a bottleneck, and it's smarter and brings in efficiency. So we also spoke about the opportunities and the investment needs that Europe needs to face, and I think you listed, first of all, infrastructure meaning building the kind of a base industry that needs to supply the rest, but also for example, carbon infrastructure and all the enablers. I think one important opportunity that you mentioned is Europe has the technology, has the know-how. Challenge is often in scaling this up, and the lack of suitable risk financing or taking risk capacity, both from the entrepreneurial culture, but also in terms of risk taking for scaling it up. And I think you also mentioned the need of incentives, Martin, or having the right incentives and not only the right sticks, let's say, that we have with the regulations. So I hope I have summarized the key points of this exchange, and I wanted to thank you very much for this discussion. Can we have an applause for our panelists?
thank you for having moderated this panel. Big thank you to our panelists for this very, very interesting exchange and giving us some hints on how to rebuild the industrial capacity in the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at the end of day 1 of the EIB Group Forum 2024. I think we had an amazing day, fruitful exchanges, great keynote speeches, and I think this was only possible due to our amazing speakers, and I think we need a round of applause just for them, to thank them. And you are now invited to a networking dinner. I wish you a very, very pleasant evening. And I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow morning here at 9 o'clock for day 2 of this forum. Have a great evening and thank you for your attention. Enjoy.